Start recording. Hello everyone and welcome to Handmade Hero, the show we code a complete game live on stream. And today we are going to fix our first GPU driver bug, which I can pretty much guarantee you will not be our last. Before I do that, I'll just simply mention today is day 246, so if you would like to follow along at home and you are someone who pre-ordered the game on handmadehero.org, you should unpack day 245 source code, because that is the source code that I'm going to be starting with today. And if for some reason you unpack some different source code than that, you are not going to know what's going on at all. You're going to be like, I have no idea what I'm looking at. This is not what Casey has, and that is because you did it wrong. So don't do that. What am I talking about driver bug? What do I even mean? Well, obviously it's not happening on this machine, because if it was happening on this machine, we'd see it yesterday when we actually did this. But you can see here is our cutscenes running, and they appear to be running correctly. This is, of course, running through the hardware renderer. Now you will note we didn't really have much in the way of problems when we had a software render. That is because we were not involving the GPU of the system at all, which of course is where a lot of the sort of system peculiarities come in, because the protocols for talking to GPUs are incredibly weird and contorted, and the GPUs themselves are very varied and change a lot from year to year, so it's very likely that you have a problem with compatibility as soon as you start using a GPU. If you don't use the GPU, you have very little problems with compatibility typically. But most games nowadays have to use the GPU if they want to be competitive graphically, because most of the graphics horsepower machine is on the GPU. So what I found out from people who post on the forums, if you test this on NVIDIA, our using multiple threads for downloading textures was not working properly on there. And what they said was that for some reason, and I've sent, oh wait, I keep forgetting I don't have to use Emacs anymore. What they said was that for whatever reason, if you create all of the context you're going to use, all the OpenGL context on the main thread, and then pass them down to the other threads, well then it's fine and it works. But if you create those threads, if you create those contexts actually on separate threads, that doesn't work. And so I don't really know why. I sent email to NVIDIA and I gave them the source code to Handmade Hero, and I was just like, can you tell us why? And I'll explain it on the stream if you can send us an explanation. So we don't know why. I would assume that it's something relatively straightforward, like, oh, we set the data on the thread local storage of the particular thread that initially calls to OpenGL, and so there is no information on the other threads with which to create new contexts or something like this. I don't really know what that answer is going to be. I could, try to imagine one, but I don't actually know. So certainly there's some explanation for it. We don't know exactly what it is. All we know is that it does not work there. And so actually I don't need to load that. Let me load this up. So all we do know is that it doesn't work to do it that way. And in general, with PC compatibility, you don't have the luxury of ever really knowing why things don't work a lot of the time. You simply have to accept the fact that if someone runs into a bug on PC, and they almost always do, that has to do with hardware that's out of your control, well, you just have to figure out a way to work around it. And in this case, it sounds like we don't have a particularly hard job ahead of us. If the only requirement for getting it working is that we create the context on the main thread and then pass them to the separate threads, well, that is something that's really easy for us to do. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that now, so that our code base we know is compliant with NVIDIA's drivers, as well as AMD drivers, and then we can go from there. So let's take a look at what we were doing before. So you've got Win32 init OpenGL here, and you can see that this sort of does our OpenGL startup. And then from then on, after Win32 init OpenGL, we had this Win32 create OpenGL context for worker thread. And that was basically what we were using from then on. So our download threads, we're calling this, and the problem, we believe, is right here. Apparently this cannot be called on anything other than the main thread. So what we need to do is we essentially need to hoist that out, and we need to call that once for every worker thread before we ever call the worker threads. And then when we call the worker threads, we need them to pick that context up and use it, if that makes sense. So that's what we're going to do here, and it's pretty straightforward. There's really not a lot to it. Essentially, the only real thing that we have to do here, the only thing that we have to do here is take our take our code for launching threads and actually give them something more robust than just a platform queue. Because right now we're sort of leaning on the platform queue code, and you can kind of see us doing that. It's called platform work queue. You can see it right here. What we're doing is we're taking this platform work queue thing, and that platform work queue is the thing that we're passing down. Now I'm going to move that out first of all because there's really, I don't think, any reason for that to be there. I'm going to move that out here because it's part of the Win32 struct definitions. And when we're actually using these here, you can see when we go into creating our threads in thread proc, you can see that what it gets passed when we start up a thread is this platform work queue, which it does need. But the platform work queue is shared among any of the threads that sort of consume work out of that queue. And since it's shared among all those threads, it means that we can't pass unique things that need to be per thread on that queue, right? So what we need to do is we need to essentially have, and it turns out we left it in there from before. So we actually already have it. Win32 thread startup, that Win32 thread startup thing that we had made before when we were almost gonna do it the other way. That's all we really need. So we just need to have this Win32 thread startup code. The Win32 thread startup code can point to the work queue that the thread is supposed to use, but it can also contain the OpenGLRC that it actually needs. And that's pretty much all we're doing, right? All right. So let's go ahead and get that set up. Let's make that happen. So what we want to do here is for our thread proc, when our thread proc gets called, what we want to do, I guess I should leave this here actually. What we want to do is say Win32 thread startup is actually the thing that you're going to get now. Win32 thread startup. I guess I could call this maybe thread. That's going to be the thing that we cast for our parameter, thread startup, like so. And then instead of getting the work queue from the parameter, now it just gets it from the queue. So we're still passing the queue through, but we're passing it sort of as a subset of the other parts of stuff because we need the OpenGL stuff. So now in here, what we're going to do is say, oh, okay, well now instead of this needs OpenGL thing that was on the queue, and we're just going to get rid of that because we don't care about that anymore. What we're going to say instead is if someone gave us as part of the thread parameters an OpenGLRC, then what we'd like to do is call wiggle make current to make that, our RC that we're going to use. Now remember, in order to do that, we also still need to make sure that we can use, that we have a DC, a Windows DC. Now technically, we're never going to render anything to the DC. All we're doing is submitting buffers. So really the preference here would just to be to say that the DC was 0, but I don't think you actually ever can do that, and we checked the NVIDIA documentation for multi-threaded texture downloads. They were passing the same DC handle that they were using before. So I believe here what we would want to do is probably just pass that DC. Just call it like OpenGL DC or something, and just say, okay, whatever they tell us to do, that's what we're going to do, all right? So I think this is roughly what we want to have is something more like this. Does that make sense? Hopefully. Oops. So something like that. So that's the actual code that we need on the thread side, and now we just need to actually, when we start up these threads, we need to actually build that bundle, right? So we need to actually make that happen. So let's take a look at where we call this thread proc right here. And so when we call Win32 make queue, we say how many of these threads we want. And so what we actually need to do now is, instead of sort of doing it this way, I think we're going to have to switch to a thing where we pass the Win32 thread startups that we actually wanted, right? Because we need these things to stick around. So we're going to go ahead and say, okay, Win32 thread startup, startups like so. And then whenever we call one of these, instead of passing that work queue to it, what we're going to do is say we're going to pass it whatever the nth startup actually is. So it's assumed that whoever calls us here is going to have filled those out with the information that they actually wanted, right? We can keep this here as a convenience feature. So what we could do if we wanted this as a convenience feature, we don't need to do this. We could force the caller to do this potentially. But if we wanted to, we could say, okay, oops. We could say, let's go ahead and get that guy out here. And then we'll go ahead and fill out the queue automatically for the caller. And that's just a convenience. That's absolutely nothing to do with anything. It's just we could just do that to make it a little easier on the caller, so that callers who don't care about this don't have to worry about setting the queue. It'll get set automatically because we know that it's known, right? So if we compile this, we'll just get the errors at the point where we do our make queue. Oops. At the point where we do our make queue. Here we go. And you can sort of see, you know what I should do, by the way? I realized that our Handmade project file is wrong. I think, I don't actually know if it is or not. But when I load it in 4Coder, it doesn't seem to set the compile correctly. Oh. Hi, wrong slash. And I'm trying to remember why, because it looks like that's where build.bat actually is. I don't know why. I'm not 100% certain on why that doesn't work. Anyway, I'll have to figure that out. Anyway, not that important now, I suppose. So let's go back to what I was saying. When we call Win32 make queue, obviously we don't have those startups in there. And so what I could do is say, okay, I'm going to make these Win32 thread startups, and these are the high price startups, and there's 6 of them. And then I can just say, all right, well, whatever the array count is of those is how many you're going to do, and there's the pointer to the startups, right? Then the low priority queues are the ones that have the OpenGL context, and they're going to have a different OpenGL context per queue, right? So I have now a thing that's like, all right, I've got to have a Win32 thread startup, low pri startups. I need 2 of those, one for each of the threads that's going to be started. And so in the low pri startups, these ones I actually want to sort of seed with some useful information. And so what I could do is say, you know, low price startup 0 equals like create thread or Win32 thread startup GL or something. Something like that. And so I can just say, hey, why don't you do whatever you need to do to make this thing happen? Here's we no longer even need any of these things to be global, which is kind of nice. So I could sort of change these to be like OpenGL DC and OpenGL RC that are local, right? There we go. And so I can call the startup function and say, oh, this is the DC and this is the RC. I want you to clone those and give me a low price startup, and maybe like this, you know, do that twice so that I've got 2 of them. And then when we do this, we just say, all right, go ahead and launch those threads. Oops, low price startups. So that's roughly what we're talking about here. So all I need to do now is write a function that essentially, instead of that OpenGL initialization that we were doing before, it's now going to sort of wrap it up in a Win32 startup struct, but basically do exactly the same thing. So I'm going to take a look at init OpenGL. Here we go, Win32 OpenGL. If I take a look here at the stuff I've got, let's see, Win32 create context for worker thread, this guy. Really all I want to do is I just want to replace this function with the new one that we've got. So I want it to do exactly what it was doing before, but now I want it to sort of bundle it in this way for me so that it's ready to do thread startup. So there we go. So that's really all we're talking about here. So assuming that we actually can do what we want it to do, like assuming we actually have a wiggle context startup situation happening here, then what we want to do is say, all right, the window DC, hold on a second. We don't need here anymore because we've got one. So we can get rid of that, and we can actually call this the OpenGL DC. The share context is going to be this one that got passed in, so that actually also doesn't have to be there. In fact, we could call it here, share context. The attributes we already have, assuming that we got back the modern DC, that's really all that needs to happen. And so in some sense, all of this stuff can actually go away, right? So really all we want to do is say, all right, there's the Win32 thread startup. This is the result. The result, yeah, OpenGL DC is going to be the OpenGL DC. The result, oops. The result OpenGL context is going to be the one that we make. And that's really it. So that's all the business that has to happen. So if we do that, then I think we're in the right position now. for everything to kind of flow smoothly. We can get rid of the concept that there's things that need OpenGL, because now we either pass it or don't, and it can detect it just from that. And so the only thing that I need to do now is I need to see if this works at all, right? Because we also don't know if this will work on AMD, right? We know that people thought it worked on NVIDIA, but we don't know whether it works on AMD, because we're now changing the way that from what we know worked on AMD before, ladies and gentlemen, the wonders of Win32 compatibility. So if we step in here to where we create our threads, OpenGL has already been initialized, obviously, so that's all good. You can see us kind of go through this here. We create the high priority queues. Those won't have OpenGL. Now we create the low priority queues. You can see me sort of going through here and creating those startup structures should now mean that we have, oops, here we go. We should have OpenGL context for all of our threads. And you can see that it looks like we did not get them, I want to say. That doesn't look like that worked. So we gotta see why. All right, so let's go in here. Here we go. So we get that OpenGL DC. We call will create context arbs, and we've got the share context. Oh, which is null. Oops. Why is it null? Win32 init OpenGL should be working. Oh, right. Got to go delete those global variables. We tried intentionally to get rid of them, and then we never got rid of them. And surprisingly, you can't use a global variable if you actually stopped initializing it at all. So good. We got rid of these two, which is kind of something I just wanted to be able to do, because I just didn't feel like they needed to be global. So let's try that one more time. All right. There's the high priority startups. Now we'll go through the low priority startups. Here we go. And even just by the pause there, we can tell that we got it again. So now we've got two of those. And now we're going to go into this function. We're going to have to set one here, so when we actually get a thread in there, we'll see what it does. Here's that thread startup code. Got the DC, got the RC, it's got the queue. So now it can go ahead and make that current, which is what it'll do. This other thread will come in here. It'll also make current. So now both of our threads have gotten their GLs set up and are ready to go. In theory now, if this actually is something that does in fact work, we should be able to, let's see, run this here. There we go. We should be able to see textures, and we do. So now we're creating our OpenGL context on the main thread, and then we're passing those OpenGL contexts through to the individual threads, to the worker threads, to set as current. And it looks like it works just fine on AMD, so that's good. We don't know if this will work on NVIDIA, but it might. And so at least now we can send this back over. Well, we can, when we update the code tonight, people who were testing on a video can tell us, does that resolve the problem? So there we go. So that's really all that has to happen for that. Now, there's one more thing that we haven't really done on the OpenGL side of things, and that's that if you look at what we were doing here, I think I even mentioned this before when I said, do we actually need to worry about this or not? We have not gone back and actually seen whether we in fact do need to worry about it. And that is that in here, in our Win32, sorry, not in there, in here, in our int attrib list, where we're creating our frame buffer, where we're choosing the pixel format for our frame buffer, we requested wiggle frame buffer sRGB capable arb, and we're passing true, which as far as I know is how we're supposed to signal that we want sRGB on the frame buffer. Now, what I don't know is whether it's legal to pass that if the driver hasn't told you that it supports frame buffer sRGB. Like, will it just sort of crash on that, or will something very bad happen? So what I wanted to do is try to at least search or find out if there was something in the documentation for wiggle choose pixel format arb that would tell us whether the driver was required to pass over values it didn't know or not, because I really just couldn't tell you. I have absolutely no idea. So we could see here. Let's see. The following values are accepted, and here's the following values that it lists. Points to buffers, the values accordingly placed. Focus the seed, this is get pixel formats. Again, we don't really care. We care about choose pixel formats. This one special list attribute type pairs. All the attributes in attributes are followed by the corresponding desired value. The list is terminated with 0 if it's null, same value was empty. We don't care about that. Okay, so we could have passed 0 for the float attrib list, which I didn't do, but I probably should have. Okay, the result same as empty, blah, blah, blah. Let's see here. If the function C is true, if the function fails to return 0 to get extended information, you get the error. If fails to return the concept before it's undefined. Select pixel formats to return based on the attribute value specified. We know all that. We have not learned anything. Let's see. If both an error is generated if p attribute I list or p attrib f list contain invalid attribute, or if HTC is invalid. So to me, that would suggest that we are not allowed to call it, or we are not allowed to put that in the list unless it's actually legal, right? That seems to me. Yeah. So I think what we're going to have to do is check for its existence first, and that's a huge pain in the butt as well. Again, this is just the whole I don't know why they wouldn't have said that attributes were ignored if they weren't known, but oh well. That's what you would do, right? But I don't know. Anyway, so in OpenGL we have a thing that can search for extensions. In fact, you can see here we've got a thing that searches for extensions, and that's all well and good. Unfortunately, that's the thing that searches for OpenGL extensions. It is not a thing that searches for Wiggle extensions. So we don't actually know what the Wiggle extensions are without using Wiggle get extension string, which is a different thing than GL get string GL extensions. So we would have to call Wiggle get extension string and search that, which I think is what we'll have to do. Now, we could, if we wanted to, instead actually just use this guy and say, oh, okay, GLX frame buffer sRGB, if that's present, then obviously it is going to support that for the destination output. We probably could say that, and we'd probably be right, but technically, since you can use a texture as a frame buffer, in theory, there is an OpenGL implementation would not be erroneous if it said that it supported X frame buffer sRGB, but did not support using it on the actual frame buffer. That's possible. It could be that it only supports using it on a texture, on rendered texture, right? So I feel like to actually do the full due diligence here, we would probably have to actually do this same search again, and check the Wiggle extension string to see whether it's there. I can't say that's a very nice thing to have to do, but I guess we'll do it anyway. So let's take a look here at our Wiggle extensions and figure out how to do that. Now, like I said, it's kind of a pain in the butt. It's kind of the ultimate irony because in order to check if there's a Wiggle extension, I'm just going to let this sink in for a second. In order to check for to see if you can load a particular Wiggle extension, you have to load a Wiggle extension. Not kidding, actually true. Wiggle get extension string or extensions string. It's an extended thing that you have to do, and you got to call it. And when you call Wiggle get extension string, it will you first get the pointer to it, and then you call it, and it tells you what extensions there are. Hilariously, of course, you can never check to see if it exists in the proper way, because you never would have been able to get a string that would have had it in it. And so you just have to call Wiggle get proc address and then see whether or not you get something back, if that makes sense. Then you can start calling it, but only then. So yeah, pretty hilarious. It'd be, either you can laugh about it or you can cry about it. I'll leave that decision up to you as the home programmer. Now, If we go ahead here and look at our other wiggle get proc addresses, we can sort of see, we can sort of see that they are sitting in here. They all get sort of grabbed at the same time, and this is a fine time for us to grab that one as well. Get extension string. What was it called? Did I copy and paste it? I did. We'll get extension string, get extensions string ext, and I guess we didn't put ext on the end of swap interval, but I don't know why. I'm gonna put it on there now. We'll get proc address, and there we go. So if we get that back, we can call it, and then that way we can figure out whether or not we support sRGB. So I think I'll do that right here. Like, we'll just go ahead and call that immediately. So what we'll say is, if we got that back, we'll get extension string x. Then what we'd want to do is say, okay, once we've got wiggle extension string x back, then we will call it and find out what those extension strings are. So these are our extensions. And then we'll just use literally the exact same loop here, but just we'll check for, you know, we'll check for whatever the rest of the stuff is, right? So there we go. All right, so if we get the extensions string, we then are going to loop over. I don't know what the count end at thing, I don't know why that is actually the way it is, but we're not going to touch it. We're just going to assume it's fine. So what I'm going to do here is just say we're going to search for the one that we're actually looking for, and then if we get it, we'll set that sRGB thing to be thumbs up. So what we need to do here is, and you know, at this point it seems like we may actually want to wrap these up in some kind of a nice little container, because they've all got to be essentially global variables just sitting here. And it might be nicer if we could just have it as like a little self-contained thing so it's easier to see. It doesn't really change the code hardly at all, but you know, rather than having to look at all these and guess that they're all going together, maybe we could put them in a struct. It's just a thought. So here's extension string. Excuse me. And that's all well and good. We'll get extension string ext. We then need some kind of a way to say global variable, you know, B32. OpenGL supports sRGB frame buffer. And what we'll do is, if we find that extension that tells us that the frame buffer is legal to support, then we will go ahead and put that in there. Oops, that's not what I wanted at all. That was not what I wanted. We'll go ahead and put that in there as true. So then when we know that that's true, and we come down here, what I want to do is say, okay, I want to pass this list of things, right? But if it turns out that we can't actually pass this one, then I don't want to pass that one, right? And it's like 1, 2, it's, you know, or I should say it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5 down, right? So what I can do is I can just say like, well, you know, if the OpenGL doesn't support this thing, then what I can do is say whatever that guy was, the you know, the fifth one down, right? So this is 0, 1, right? 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and then this is 10. I can just zero it out and say stop the list there, right? Not particularly pretty. Oh, and I forgot, we can also do this apparently. Not particularly pretty, but it's the easiest way to do it for now. And I'll have a little comment on that in a second here. So that all seems relatively fine to me. The only thing we need to know now is what is the OpenGL, what is the actual OpenGL supports sRGB frame buffer string we should be looking for? Like, what is the string that goes in here? And I don't actually know. So we need to go look at the sRGB frame buffer OpenGL extension and see what it actually is, right? Now, there should be an extension string. I guess it's just going to be arb frame buffer sRGB. I guess it's just going to be that, right? So if we see that, we know we're good to go. So there we go. So if we see that, we think we could probably go go from there. And that's all well and good. So we now just need the function prototype for that guy, I guess. Was the only other thing that I forgot to grab. So let's go ahead and grab that. Here it is. And that can just be thrown on in there. So there's that type def. And we know this is obviously a WinAPI call. And we already know what we wanted to call it. It was wiggle get extension string ext, and that's it for there. So yeah, I think that's just about it. I guess I did never rename the variable for this guy to ext, which I said I wanted to do. Wiggle swap here. Where is that called? Wiggle swap. There it is. So now we should be good. Get extension string x initializing. Oh, cannot convert. Oh, I beg to differ. And this guy, actually, I guess this is just that. So let's see. Local variable. Oh, whoops. So much slower than I used to be with modal editing. I haven't really gotten it bound up very well, and I'm not as used to it as I should be, so it's kind of frustrating, but what are you going to do? All right, so let's take a look at where we're at here. Actually, I guess I want to kind of jump back a bit and just take a look at that init stuff now. So what we want to do is come through here and take a look at that extension string code. So here's the extension string code. Let's see if we got it back. Yeah, we did. So let's see what those extensions actually are. I have no idea what this card would have for arb extensions. Let's find out. So hilariously, it tells us that it has wiggle arb extension string. Not that we wouldn't have automatically known that, because in order to do that, we would have, in order to even see the string, we would have to have already used it. But for completeness. So we've got the pixel format stuff, we've got multi-sample, we've got swap control, p-buffers, render to texture, read buffers, buffer regions. There's that wiggle x frame buffer sRGB right there. So that's good. Oops. So yeah, seems reasonable. See if we actually detect it. So let's see. Right now, our OpenGL supports sRGB frame buffer is 0. We finished the parsing loop, and it is still 0. That did not go as I would have hoped. To say the very least, not great. Not great. Not great, Bob. All right, so let's try that one more time. Here we go. And now, just make sure that I'm actually looking for the right thing. I'm looking for wiggle arb frame buffer. Oh, no, that's the wrong one. It doesn't actually have that one. It has the ext version of it, but not the arb version. They're the same, but it's the different string. So we should actually look for this one, because we don't actually care about the arb one per se. We just care that it supports even the ext one. So that's good to know. I suppose it does make sense usually to look, instead of the arb, to look for the ext one, because if you can use the ext one, it's going to be available in more places than the arb one, right? Because the older the driver, the less likely it is to have the arb ones or who knows what, right? So I wonder to what extent we should actually be trying to look for like ext versions of these instead. I don't know. No biggie. Anyway, so let's try that one more time. And here we go. So that's set to 0. We run to here. It's set to 1. So great. And so off we go. So I think that's good. I think that's all good. And obviously we're still rendering. So in doing all this stuff for compatibility's sake, we have not broken anything. And so that's a plus. That brings us to the question of, is there anything else OpenGL related that we actually needed to do, that we wanted to do? And I don't know that there is at the moment. We have, I guess, about, we've got about 25 minutes left, which is quite a bit of time. So I'm not 100% sure what we should be doing now because I can't think of anything super OpenGL-y that we probably would want to do. Because that's really the only thing that we actually needed there. Where's the list? Where's the list? Oh wait, it's the to-do. There we go. So let's see. We've got flush all thread queues before reloading DLL. Okay, that's something we could go try to do. We've got debug code. We've got some audio debugging, rendering, some stuff here with hardware rendering. So we actually did this. We did sRGB frame buffer and textures. We did VSync. We did background texture downloads. We just didn't do render to texture. So I don't know if we want to try to do render to texture. We don't really have anything right now that uses render to texture, but we could come up with something that used render to texture. I just don't know if that's maybe, is that too big? I mean, to start 25 minutes render to texture, maybe I could understand. Hard to say. Render to texture, I mean, is a very basic operation. Basically, what it's just a way of saying, instead of always rendering to the thing you're going to display on the screen, I want to render to something that I will then use in a subsequent render step as a source texture, as something to pull from, right? It's a very basic concept, really not much to it. But it involves a bunch of fussing in OpenGL, as you might expect. Everything always involves a bunch of fussing. So that's really the only thing on the hardware renderer that we had there, and it had a question mark over it. So I don't know that that's something we want to necessarily do now. Or not, but we're definitely getting down to the end of it here. There's not a whole lot here that's left, so that makes it a little tougher. Makes it a little tougher. I don't know. I really don't. I don't have a concrete idea of what should actually be going on there. I feel like in general, 25 minutes. Let's do flush all thread queues before reloading DLL. I feel like flush all thread queues before reloading DLL is something that maybe would only take 25 minutes, possibly, and it's in the Win32 platform layer, which is where we are at least. So it's not like totally switching gears, and it's not like render to texture, which I think is going to be a more involved topic. We definitely wouldn't finish it in 25 minutes. So let's take a look at flush all thread queues before reloading DLL. So the way that this works right now, and I don't really know to what extent, we should probably test to see where we're at in terms of live code loading, because we haven't done much with it. And so I don't really know at the moment to what extent we would have problems if we tried to use our live code loading. So let's just take a look at that, because I'm just kind of curious. So if I come over here to 4Coder and I just make it a little smaller. So first we'll just try, if I just rebuild, what happens? Game is still working, so apparently the reload is fine. And let's see if I make a change to the code somewhere. So I'm going to go into handmade.cpp. And I guess we'll just look for maybe some hero rendering code. I don't know. Oh wait, that's not here anymore. That's actually over in the world mode. We started moving things around a little bit. So if we're doing some of this stuff here, let's look for some rendering code of some kind that we can tweak. We just need something where we'll be able to visually see on our screen. Like here we go. So here's entity type hero, and here's some movement code for it. And I don't know if this is, let's see, push bitmap, entity transform. So here's like some stuff. So I should be able to just like comment out some of this stuff, right? And then if I rebuild, I won't see it. Yeah. So there we go. we're in relatively good shape. But, and I'm imagining this might actually be exactly the bug I'm talking about. I'm not sure though. No, it's not. This is actually just for this is the debug thing. So we have two bugs as far as I know with live code editing that we probably should try to fix. One of them is the one on the to-do list there. The other one's this one. This, I believe, the problem here is that when this menu stuff happens with our debug menus, I think we're not necessarily copying everything that we should be copying out of the string store of the game. So, you know, we've got all our stuff in the DLL. The strings are in the DLL. When we reload the DLL, those strings move around. So we can't point to any strings and count on that actually working. And the debug system, I think, at the moment, doesn't do that properly. So you can see here, like, it's doing some stuff, and it's probably keeping a stale pointer around that then sort of gets broken. So that's one of them. The other one that we've got is that technically we're using function callbacks, right? In one particular place, and that is the work queue. So right now we have a thing that's like, where is that work queue? Where is Mr. Work Queue? Contribute2, handmade.cpp, process, or is it probably do work? So here's do worker work, and actually I guess that's not the actual, that's just the stub one that we used for testing. So it's actually up in here, right? Win32 do next work queue entry is the actual thing we care about. Win32 do next work queue entry. And that guy is the thing that's in theory would cause us a problem. Because you can see right here it calls this entry callback, and that callback is not necessarily in the same place from one build to the next. So when the DLL that has that function in it gets reloaded, if there's work sitting on the work queue that persists, right, from you know, the frame 0, somebody queues up a job, and it's pointing to the DLL that's loaded at that time. It says this is the place to jump for the work. And then you go to the next frame, and it has reloaded the DLL, and now is a different DLL. That callback eventually gets called, and it's pointing into garbage, and it crashes or something, right? So that could easily happen to us. There's nothing protecting that at the moment. So there's two ways we could solve this problem. One is that we could have the work queues persist across the frames and not have to worry about the callbacks by getting rid of the concept of using the function callback in the first place, right? So instead what we could do is just use a single entry point for workers in the main game code that just has a switch statement, and the switch statement will jump to the right function that we actually want to call, right? That gets us out of that business entirely. So that's one way. However, now that I think about it, that doesn't really help us because in theory we might still be executing some code in that previous DLL. So if we were to unload it, I don't even know what happens at that point. I don't know what happens in Windows when you try to unload a DLL that you're currently actually executing. I assume you crash? I don't know, to be completely honest with you. I'm not sure. So I feel like that doesn't help us. So I feel like we really do need a thing which says that if we're going to load, we have to wait for the queues to completely drain out. And then once the queues have completely drained out, then we can continue. So this right here is probably all we really need, is Win32 complete all work. We just need to call that on every queue, right, that we've got. And once we call that on every queue, we know that we're done. So what I can probably do is just say, all right, whenever we go to reload, right, right here, right? Wow. Okay. That's fantastic. Who didn't update, people? Who didn't update the to-do file? Will somebody please tell me who didn't update? We didn't update the to-do file. We already did that. Look. It's right there. We're even better than we thought we were, people. Give yourselves a big old pat on the back. Anyway. All right, well, I got nothing. I don't know what to say. We already fixed that. So that was sort of anticlimactic. So yeah, so we're down to this stuff now. I would basically say that over here, we've got render to texture and shaders, right? I feel like we probably want to do those a little later. Because that's going to just be for special effects and things like that. Oh, and hey, look, this guy's still in there. We don't need that anymore. So yeah, I don't know. Maybe we'll just call it for today. I really don't know what to do. The only things we need to like move on, like we need to go start working on the debug code, is what we need to do. So maybe we just call it and we start on Monday. It's a short coding day because I took, to be fair, I took an extra 20-30 minutes the other day. So maybe I should just go to the Q&A now and call it. Because yeah, I think now it's time to just go finish this up. I think we just want to finish these two, next week and try to have a good finishing week. Because I'd like to get started on the gameplay code, like I said, and we're not very far from that. Because I feel like, yeah, we could just get through these guys here, and then we'd be ready to do whatever final rendering work we want to do, and then go from there. And I could say that maybe if we do that render pass, we could just go ahead and say, all right, let's do that in here as well. We'll do a little bit of that once we actually get that these architectural things all straightened out. Then we just finish up the hardware render as well because we'd need shaders to do like the lighting or something. I don't know. Seems reasonable. I'm just gonna say that because yeah, I don't know. It was a bad day for ideas. I was out of ideas of what we should do that wasn't going to be starting one of these things, and there isn't that much left on the to-do list that we can actually do that isn't, starting something major. All right, so I'm going to go to the QA then. It'll be an easy Friday. Everyone's off the hook. And yeah, Pseudonym 73, that's basically what it ended up being. What should we do for the next 20 minutes? Well, we should go find out that our to-do items already got to-do'd. I probably should have looked through more of these. Maybe there's stuff on here that's I don't even know that we did that I didn't think so. I didn't think we did. I thought this was all stuff we hadn't done yet. But I don't know. Maybe not. Yeah, I don't know. Cubic, there's a bug in the new if you added is not checking the sRGB variable, but a different one. Ah, okay. Let me go check that. One, also, I should mention this. One kind of annoying problem, too, is... oh, whoops. Yeah, that was a completion bug. That's what we actually wanted, right? One thing I should mention is you can kind of see, yeah, I've talked about this a lot of times, and I actually think OpenGL was a pretty well-designed API for its day, like back in the day. And so I don't really want to harsh on OpenGL, to be honest with you. And so I'd like to just caveat that and say that this is not really, has nothing really to do with OpenGL, but I just wanted to point this out. So you saw all the stuff that we had to do with OpenGL to do the multi-thread, the overlap texture download, right? And the sRGB frame buffer. The reason it's so important for APIs to be cleanly designed is because all of that stuff we just did probably had, well, you saw, Cuber Caleb caught a bug right there. That bug, that typo that I did, should never have even been possible. Because all we should have had to have done was put, if the API was properly designed, then this would just be able to be placed there, and it would ignore it if it wasn't capable of doing it, right? Because there's nothing, our app's not going to do anything else, right? And if we wanted to, then you would want the API to just have a query that says, can you do this? You wouldn't want me to have to change what I'm passing to you, even so, right? And so it's kind of a good example. All that stuff we had to do with the multi-threads and the context, blah, 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 all of that is just meaningless code. All you can possibly do in that code is screw up, right? And so what you're basically doing is you're creating all these opportunities for bugs on the developer side. And they're very likely to make them because A, they don't know. Like, we don't know. I mean, you saw we had a bug on the NVIDIA driver there. We have no idea that that bug might be there. It's not in the documentation that we have no idea that that could even be a possibility. We're just trying to get the context, so we gave it a shot. And it turned out the way we did it happened to be wrong for some unknown reason on this particular driver. So really, the reason that API design is so important is just because every time you make a mistake like that, you create more opportunities for bugs. And if you take a look at how many opportunities there were for bugs in just that one thing, there are dozens of places in our code now, none of which need to be there, none of which actually do anything, all of which may contain a bug. And that's because the API is not designed properly, right? And if you want, a preview of a small part of my Vulkan rant, it's that, right? It's that it is absolutely not designed to try to keep the bugs down. It is like a festival of things that you could do wrong. And every, one OpenGL call you might see, there's going to be like 30 Vulkan calls, right? Not my biggest complaint with it. It's a minor thing, but they were extremely opposed to the notion of trying to work on the API more to reduce the number of bug points and to increase the chances that the error handling on the app side would be reasonable. And I don't care how low level or how special purpose your API is, it doesn't matter. It's still extremely important that you consider bug-free use to be a high priority because, again, bugs happen a lot. And if you don't design your API with that in mind, you're just proliferating the number of bugs in the world, Wait, hold on a second. I'm just getting in the chat now. Is the HMH bot down? Is the Handmade Hero bot down? Uh-oh. So the HMH bot is down. We moved it over to another server and it's having rough times. Well, that is very sad. I don't even know if I want to do Handmade Hero if the bot's not here. Now, if InsoBot is still functioning, then I'm okay. Because and there it is. Thank you to, what did it say? InsoBot, what did InsoBot say? InsoBot said something. Thank you to Imperium Tactics for following the channel. Oh, well, that's really not a very insightful thing with InsoBot. InsoBot says some much more insightful things, certainly. But as long as I can see that InsoBot is there, then I'm okay. I'm okay with that. But it would be nice to have HMH bot as well. Gary Johansson, totally serious when I say you should write an API book. I would never think of lots of stuff. Well, I have that lecture, and nobody still pretty much does the things that I talked about in there. So, I mean, I could write a book, but, would anyone read it? I don't know. I mean, there's a thing, if you type in... yeah. So there's this guy right here. And, I mean, it's got most of the basic principles in there, you know? And, it's pretty much like... I think if you do the stuff that's talked about in the lecture, then you end up with a pretty usable API. And almost nobody actually does them. So I just asked the kid, for the keyboard gamepad inputs, can half transition count ever go beyond 1, or is it there if you put the input getting on a separate thread? Yeah, it can't ever go beyond 1 at the moment. For gamepad inputs, I don't know about keyboard inputs because I don't know if we do WM key down, in which case it could, the half transition count could go above it. So could mouse. So it's basically there. It can go beyond 1 for circumstances where the where we're processing the message loop. So if we look at let's see, key, yeah. This right here. So here's Win32 process pending messages. So do you see this stuff here where we do Win32 process keyboard message? I think, I don't actually know, but let's see. I think that means that at least for the keyboard, you could get it to be higher. Let's find out. 32 process keyboard message. Yeah, so for keyboards, it definitely could be higher than 1. And the reason for that is this is running through the message queue. So basically, if Windows queues up a key up, key down, key up, key down on our thread queue, which, you know, it could. I don't know that it ever will because it might not pull the keyboard frequently enough. I have no idea. But if it did, then that count would go up, right? The gamepad, since we only pull it once a frame right now, that shouldn't be able to. But like you said, if we decided later that we wanted it to be pulled more frequently, we could pull it more frequently. And so I think it's important for the API to have that in there, if that makes sense. I feel like we want to set ourselves up for success by making it so that if we find that it's too slow to have it, it's just not good enough to pull it at that frequency, we can pull it at a higher frequency and the game would still work just fine. And it wouldn't break the game in some way. Cuber Caleb, kind of graphics Windows related. Why do so many games, especially Source games, handle Alt-Tab poorly? Well, you know, there's a lot to that question. So the main reason is just because they change the display resolution, usually. So one of the things we didn't do on Handmade Heroes, we didn't change the display resolution. Now, I'm a big proponent of not changing the display resolution. The reason I don't like changing the display resolution is because you know that the user is looking at a screen where the display is working, right? Because if they weren't, they couldn't click on your game. Anytime you change the display resolution, you run the risk of changing the display to something that their monitor doesn't handle properly, or that it won't sync to right, or that's buggy, or weird, or not what they wanted, right? So I usually like to just have it be that they can run the game, and whatever their monitor's in, that's the resolution we use. That doesn't necessarily mean the game renders in that resolution. The game might want to render in a smaller resolution for speed purposes and stretch up to the higher resolution after the fact. But that's the way I prefer to do it. Now, is it a little bit slower? Yes, because you have to pay for that stretching up process. And so sometimes it may be not the best decision. And it may have been better to do change resolution. It's just a judgment call, and I would rather go the other route and say I'd rather be better behaved on people's machines that are fast enough, which is most people's machines, fast enough to do that scale up, than use the change resolution stuff and go that route. So usually that's why. When you call change resolution, then what happens is anytime Windows detects an Alt-Tab, it changes the resolution back to the default desktop resolution, right? which is a whole nother mode change, which sometimes does stuff like moves the icons around on the screen or does all these other weird things. Who knows what goes on. And it could make it so that like, oh, my game doesn't know what's going on now, blah, blah, blah. There's just this whole nightmare of stuff, right? So, is it 100% their fault? Is it partially their fault? Yes. Is it all their fault? No. A lot of it is just Windows is bad at handling resolution changes, and always has been, probably always will be. If Microsoft had done it properly in the first place, all those games would just work fine, and they would never even have to know that was going on, right? Sinocron, is there any benefit to moving the main Windows message queue to another thread? I'm sorry if you've implemented the answer to this already. I'm still catching up. Not that I can think of. So a couple things. Thing number one is window messages in general, I believe, always come to the same threads queue as created the window. So you couldn't really move the main Windows message queue to another thread per se. You couldn't literally do that, right? What you could do that would have the same effect is launch the game on another thread, right? Which would leave your main thread that created the window free to sit there and spin on the message queue, right? You could do that. So either way, I was just kind of pointing out there's a little technicality there. It doesn't change your question. Your question is still totally valid. It's just I was saying you can't quite write the line of code that's like, create thread, jump to that thread, and then that thread calls peak message and handles my thing. It's like, no, because since the main thread is the one that created the window, the peak message thread just won't ever get any of its messages. I believe that's what happens. I could be wrong. That just seems to be my recollection. But putting that aside, because like I said, you could totally implement it by just, okay, so start the game on the other thread and let the main thread do the messages. You still end up with the same circumstance. Does that have any benefits? And my answer at the moment is not that I can think of, but that doesn't mean the answer is no. Windows is obviously a very complicated world. I only know a certain amount about it. And no matter how much I think I know, there's always a new thing. I learn a new thing every day, right, on Windows, even though I've been programming it for 15 years, I don't know how long, because it's just vast and it changes all the time. And it's, one of those things that just because I don't know the reason why you might want to do that doesn't mean that someone else out there would be like, oh yeah, it's good to do that because you do this or something and it's better or something like that. So yeah, my answer is I don't know of one, but that doesn't mean that there isn't one. Part of the reason why message queues are good in general is because you don't have to babysit them. And so some of the reasons why you might want to do things on a separate thread are kind of obviated by the fact that it is a queue. So for example, if you were polling the keyboard, you might have to do that on a separate thread to make sure that you polled it frequently enough to not miss keystrokes, right? But if you're just getting your keystroke information from Windows and Windows is doing that polling itself and putting it onto a queue for you, well, now it's really just Windows that has to make sure that it pulls the keyboard frequently enough. You're just going to sit there and consume messages on the queue, and those messages can pile up. If there's been several key presses between the two times when you're asked about the queue, you're not going to miss them. You're going to get them all, right? And so part of the reason why I say I don't know of any particular reason why you would want to run that queue on a separate thread is because most of the messages that we care about getting through that thread are messages that can just pile up if we don't get to them in time. They're not going to get dropped. There are certain messages in Windows that do get dropped. And so, for example, a WM Paint message, Windows will drop a second WM Paint message if there's already a WM Paint message pending, I believe. I don't really know if it merges them or exactly what it does, but you won't get them all. They won't just keep piling up. So there's things like that that can happen, but that's good. Like from our perspective, we wouldn't have wanted tons of paint messages. It doesn't give us any information. So to the best of my knowledge, I can't think of a reason, but maybe someone on the thread can. So. Gasto5, do you use Windows GDI outside of the educational usage you have been showing? No, I don't really. I mean, there have been times in the past where I have, but as far as in a game, I don't. And you can kind of see that now. Like, we've got the two paths. We've got the software renderer and the hardware renderer. You can sort of see now that we don't really ever use GDI anymore. The hardware render path always uses it, and even if we use software rendering, we can blit through the OpenGL path. So pretty much the only thing we ever use GDI for is to create the OpenGL context, and then everything goes through OpenGL. And that same thing is true for pretty much anything you do on Windows nowadays. If you're talking about performance-oriented graphics, you really just don't use GDI. You use GDI just long enough to get DirectX up and running or OpenGL up and running, but you never actually care about GDI per se, or GDI Plus or any of the other nonsense graphics APIs that Microsoft has been proliferating lately. Direct2D, Direct Font Text or Draw, I don't even know what they called the other ones they have. Direct Font something. There's Direct, I don't even know. They've got weird graphics libraries. The only thing you ever want to do is get a handle of the graphics card and go. That's what you actually want. And that's what OpenGL does and DirectX does, and now Vulkan and Mantle and those things do. So you pretty much are going to talk to those APIs if you care about performance graphics, because there's really no other sort of logical path. So any more Q colons? If you can promote for a coder. We always do. At the end of the stream, I always do. Sounds like you know how to play drums. No, I do not know how to play drums. Sinocron, what do you think of Vulkan? Will it praise for D3D? I don't like it, but I don't really like D3D12 either, so I don't know which. I mean, API quality has almost nothing to do with whether the API takes over in these spheres, really, if that makes sense. So, like, I mean, just look at the state of APIs in general, you know. Has it ever really been the case that if this API was really good, that's the one that prevailed versus these other APIs? It's not really. It tends to be more about market forces and who's pushing one over the other, and which one does a platform vendor decide to push for some reason. You know, even if you just look at OpenGL and Direct3D, like, why are those the libraries? Like, I'm not using OpenGL or Direct3D because I think they're awesome. I'm using them because they're the only two ways to talk to the graphics hardware on Windows, right? It's not like there's these plethora of API, right? And so who knows? So will Vulkan replace D3D? Will it replace OpenGL? Who knows? It might. It might not. I think it largely depends on things that have absolutely nothing to do with whether it's good. It has to do with what vendors push and what vendors support and what Microsoft decides to do. I think that's most of it. Microsoft, to a certain degree, recently, in my estimation, seems to be losing its appetite for trying to lock people into the Windows platform per se, and they seem to be caring more about locking people into things they can maybe make more money from, like Windows Store or things like that. So I don't know how much they care about stuff like D3D. Before, locking people into their APIs, Microsoft considered to be a huge strategic advantage, and they really, really, really wanted that to be the case. And I don't know if that's really so much of their game plan anymore. You know, you see them doing things like allowing stuff to run on Linux and porting to other things and caring more about their software making money in the general case and less about Windows as this core thing. And so I think that makes it hard to predict what they're going to do. The Microsoft of 5 years ago would never have let D3D die. Never. Never in a million years. They would have specifically killed Vulkan if they had to directly, rather than let D3D die. The Microsoft of today, they might have a different agenda. Selection buffer versus ray picking versus color picking for mouse picking. I usually prefer ray picking, personally. And that's just because I feel like doing an entire another render pass is kind of expensive. Soy Sauce the Kid, for detecting long presses on keyboards, would I put a timestamp in the input struct? Sure. I mean, that's a perfectly reasonable way to do it. Basically what happens is, you know, when the key first goes down, you start a timer and you increment it as you go, and then you know how long the key's been down, right? What's the next feature you're going to work on? I think we're going to try and finish the debug code next week. Debug diagramming and stuff like that. Do you think all the modern C++ nomenclatures like C++ 11, C++ 14, C++ 17, C++ XY are an internal joke to obscure the mess the language is in? Well, I guess what I would say is I feel like it kind of underscores the fact that they don't even understand the original joke in the first place, which is odd because even the original didn't also understand the joke, because like C++, right, is a no-op. If you say C++, it increments the value of C somewhere else, but it returns, you get back C. It would be plus C if you made something better, if we were going to get something better. But C++ means somebody else made something better over in main memory somewhere that you're not going to actually get the results of in this expression. And in this expression, you're left with just C, which is kind of hilariously true, because basically that's what C++ is. It's like, well, C is in there, and you still have that, and everything else was useless, right? So C++, well stated, I guess. They picked the name right. But then C++ 11, that's not a legal C statement anymore. So they didn't even get the original joke. Like, it would have been C plus equals 11 or something, right? Or C plus 11 in parentheses. It would, like, they weren't even able to be consistent with their own joke, which I guess kind of just sums up the whole thing. Cuber Caleb, is it worth selling my soul and learning JS Python for money? I mean, I don't know, right? Let's quantify selling your soul. Let's say that whatever you're going to do with JS Python is not particularly bad for the world. Let's say it's not an advertising company. It's actually a company that does something, a real service that maybe helps society in some way, even if it's only commercial. Hey, you got to eat, right? I mean, learn JS Python and make some money. That's a totally reasonable thing to do. If you actually are talking about selling your soul, I mean, like, I'm going to go work for a company whose primary job is to, like, mess with people's lives and show crappy ads or something on a service, maybe don't do that, right? Because we all have a choice about how we affect the world, and it's what we're willing to do and what we're not willing to do. And I feel like programmers, to a large extent, don't think of themselves as having to make ethical decisions, but they absolutely do. And I feel like before you ever take a job, I don't care what kind it is, whether you're a programmer or anything else, you should always think about, do I think this is actually making society a better place, or is this largely something that's taking advantage of people and siphoning money away from more important things that could be happening, right? So I'd say, I don't know the answer to your question. The answer may be, yeah, you should do it. You should take a job for the money, and just because it's, you know, maybe in a thing that you don't think particularly interesting, you gotta eat. If it's actually selling your soul, like in the real definition, like I'm gonna go work on for like Palantir or somebody, like no, don't do that. Like no programmer should ever go to work for that company. It's just wrong. Let's see. Any thoughts on SDL2? Nah, I have not used it. Sorry, I don't have a lot of thoughts on it. What technique are you going to use for pathfinding? I don't know. Maybe RERTs. I'm not sure. We'll see when we get there. LT Demian, been doing a lot of JS. What do you think I should do next? Kind of bored with JS. You know, I feel like C is a good thing to do. I feel like doing some low-level programming in C is a good thing if you're bored with JS, because it helps you get away from the whole like everything is virtual and sort of amorphous and weird in the way that JS is. It's more like concrete. Like here's memory, and I'm actually like messing with it. And it's kind of nice. So. The buzz. Vulkan is extremely low level. That was requested by various game engine and hardware developers. There's probably a huge market for dev-friendly API to sit on top of Vulkan to shield devs from those gory details. Don't think so? Question mark. So here's what I'd say about that. First of all, whether something's low level or not has nothing to do with whether it's error prone, right? Every system has complexity in it. And some APIs which are very high level are still very complicated, right? You could take even something like, Miles Sound System or FMOD, just a sound playing API, right? And that API could be incredibly complicated. Complexity has nothing to do with whether you wrote the API properly to eliminate bugs that didn't need to happen, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing is I actually don't think Vulkan is low level. I don't think Vulkan is low level at all. And that's one of my biggest problems with it. Like I said, I don't really want to do this rant until I've had a chance to actually go through it and so I can give a more specific thing. But I don't think Vulkan's low level at all. Between Vulkan and OpenGL, I don't think either is more low level. What Vulkan actually is it's just a high level API that happens to map closely to the very instantaneous right now state of a certain intersection of GPU parts. But in 5 years, it will be no more low level than OpenGL. And the driver will be doing all kinds of crazy stuff behind your back, just like OpenGL was. When OpenGL was created, it was incredibly low level. A GL vertex call compiled to an out to a port on the CPU. It was far more low level than Vulkan ever will be or is. So the degree to which you can say something is low level has to do with what the guarantees are of what that API will actually do. And Vulkan has none. There are zero guarantees of what the API will do. It is not low level. It does not write directly to the card. It does not compile directly to any known code. It is literally as high level as OpenGL or Direct3D is right now, full stop. And so what people actually mean when they say it's low level is they mean it happens to be more closely approximate the series of steps a bunch of driver writers who are willing to sort of tell each other a little bit about what their drivers did sort of came up with as a common set of steps that might be happening right now for our current batch of cards. That does not mean low level. An actual low level API for graphics cards would be one where there were almost no API calls. It would just be like, here's a way to map memory, and then you just write into the memory, right? And you're in charge of building the command buffers, you're in charge of everything, right? And that API would be awesome, because that would have been an actual spec that then hardware vendors would have had to make their hardware comply with, and that is not what Vulkan is. Nor is it what Vulkan will ever be, right? So yeah. It's a disappointment because I thought that that's what Vulkan was going to be. I thought Vulkan was going to be an agreed upon spec for basically getting rid of the API. And instead what it is they just multiplied the size of the API by like 1,000. So now there's like, hundreds and hundreds of API calls. And most of them probably won't map to anything that hardware does in 5 years or 10 years. Right? And it's just OpenGL all over again. Gasto5, how much do you follow the latest technologies? Do you think it is a waste of time to learn the latest graphics API for indie development? Yeah, probably. I mean, it depends on the circumstance, right? Like, what I would say is that depending on what you're trying to do with your indie game, I don't actually know what might be the best approach. If you're trying to distinguish yourself by being graphically, by doing something special graphically, then it might make a lot of sense to spend time following the latest technologies in graphics because, well, how are you going to distinguish yourself graphically if you're not doing something that's pretty fancy, right? But if, on the other hand, your big calling card is your art style, and that art style is more about what the artists are doing and not about what your technology allows, or if your indie game's more about some specific gameplay thing that you're looking at, then how much does being up to the latest technologies really affect that? Maybe it doesn't, right? And that's similar across, that's across all things, right? Like, the choice, people often ask, why don't I just use, Unity to make a game, or why don't I just do this, or why don't I just do that? And the answer is that, all decisions that you might make in game development have, pros and cons. And so if you are happening to make a game that maybe it maps very well to an existing engine, then you should use that engine, right? The point of being a game developer and remaining educated on these things and being good at your job has a lot more to do with knowing what you should do as opposed to how to do it. Obviously, knowing how to do it is important once you know that it's something you want to do, but being a capable developer has to do with making those good decisions. If your only ability as a developer is to have to use Unity, or your only ability as a developer is to have to use OpenGL, and you can't do anything else, and you don't even know whether you should know to do anything else, that's very limiting. It means that you will not make good development decisions by definition, because even if you were going to definitely use an engine, maybe the Unreal Engine was better, right? Maybe that would have been a much better choice for this circumstance or something, right? Maybe Amazon's new engine, Lumberyard or Timber Mill or Sawdust or whatever they called it, I have no idea. Maybe that would have been a better choice, right? And so keeping up with new technologies, I would say learning the latest graphics API is probably not so important. Knowing that there are other graphics APIs and why you might need to look into them, that is kind of important, right? Because if you don't know about Vulkan or what it is, but it turns out that using it for this game was going to be important, you've made a mistake. And you've let your team down as a programmer by not being aware that there was some path you should have been pursuing. And so I think I said this before on the stream, and I'll just re-emphasize it here. That is a very important part of knowing how to program. It's one of the reasons I do Handmade Hero as well. It's one of the big reasons for it is that a lot of programmers now don't know how to do low-level code. And if you don't know how to do low-level code, there's a bunch of decisions you won't make well, even if you're using an engine, even if you're not programming at the low level. And so having that knowledge base is really important. And you're not really doing a service to your team as if you're a core programmer and you don't know how to make those kind of good decisions. That's what I would say. And so I feel like everyone who's going to be a serious programmer needs to know all of this stuff and be able to make good decisions. Even if that decision is not doing the thing that you knew about. Let's see. Erdamina, why should no programmer work for Palantir? Well, Palantir is basically a company which creates data mining tools for all the people you hate, right? The whole thing about how do we write code that finds all the Muslims or whatever, right? That's Palantir. So all the evil stuff the U.S. government does, it's pretty much a company set up to do that. And they're not proud. They'll sell their technology to other people as well, but that's pretty much what they do. I feel like you're making a very ethically bad decision if you ever agree to work for a company like that. It's not right. It's like programmers, it's the Manhattan Project thing. It's you got to think through, you got to actually consider just because you're a scientist doing science things, you have to try to figure out how you're going to make sure that the world doesn't become a worse place because of the things that you did, you know? Guitarm 87. Does John use more C++ specific stuff than yours do? Does John... You mean when John is programming, does he use more C++ stuff? The answer is yes, if that's what you're asking. John, in general, uses a bunch of C++ features that I don't use. He uses virtual functions. He uses... I don't think he uses private data very much, although other people on his team do. He uses, like, lambdas sometimes, I think. And once in a while, he'll use a template. He's very light on the C++, even so. So he does use more than me, but not that much more. He'll use a few more features, but he even doesn't really use them very often. Probably one of the reasons he's making his own language is because he doesn't like the features in C++. And like me, he would like more features, but he would like them to work his way, and so that's what JAI is, right? He's like, I want the things that virtual functions should have given me and didn't, so I'm going to go implement what I think that should have been, and then he's going to have a language that actually is able to do the things he was trying to do in C++ and couldn't, What do you think about the new Snowdrop game engine? I don't know anything about it. I believe that's the one used on like the Division, but I've never seen the engine. I mean, I've seen the Division. The Division looks nice, but I mean, I don't know. You can't really judge an engine by that. Computers are real fast nowadays, so pretty much all the engines look decent. If the artists were good. Cuberkillab, do you plan on using Vulkan considering the performance differences that people have been claiming exist? I don't know. Obviously on NVIDIA, you don't really need Vulkan for anything, because you can get very good performance on OpenGL. But on AMD, there's no question, because their OpenGL drivers are quite a bit worse. And so if you want to be fast on AMD cards, then I wouldn't be surprised if the only way to do that was by using Vulkan. That said, we're a small developer, right? And if it comes down to like, well, I could do this whole Vulkan path just to make the game run faster on AMD cards, probably wouldn't do that, right? Like, that's a bad decision compared to me going and improving the interactive fiction tech, right? And since I think Vulkan is a giant pile, like I have no vested interest in supporting it, so it's not getting me any, it's not getting me any real benefit there. So, hard to say. Belrain, since you write everything from scratch, why not use a language like Go? Because Go is like super high level, right? I don't really like high level languages that much. It's just not my jam. Which I guess is different from high level features. I like high level features. I just don't like high level languages. Sanchez 1337. If any, what games have you been playing recently, and how did you like them? I haven't really played much. I was on RSI break, and I didn't really think playing a lot of games would be a good idea, right? So. I have noticed that there is no more send email on the Handmade Hero website. Do you still reply to emails? I usually do, yes, but I was just getting too many of them to answer, so I just made the forums so that people could post on there, and then other people can usually answer the questions for them if they're just questions about something that other people know. So I would say if you really have to email me something, go right ahead, but if it's actually just a question about the series, then the forums is a much better place for it so that I can answer it in a public place where other people can see it, or somebody who... Usually what ends up happening is Martin's Mosaico answers the question because he apparently knows the answer to literally every question, and he is always on the forums. So pretty much every time I see a question on the forums, Martin's has already answered it. It's kind of crazy. He should really be the one doing this. Just turn over the stream to him. Where do you see the game development community going in the next 5 to 10 years? I have no idea. What are the main differences in the example C and the language your friend is developing in 3 sentences or less? I mean, you'd have to ask him. Anonymous 835, do you have experience with POSIX Linux system calls, fork, for example? Yes, I have called fork. I need to create a small process scheduler, but when I create a fork inside a for cycle, it messes up. I need to create n amount of processes, then save them to a FIFO list and start executing one at a time. So, I mean, I guess what I would say is, I don't see why fork would actually break if you called it inside a for loop. It shouldn't. Are you sure you're not doing something else wrong? I mean, that said, I don't know that I ever have myself called fork inside a for loop. I don't do that much Linux programming. But basically what happens when you call fork is you get a clone of your process with a memory set to copy on write. And one of the people who calls fork gets back one parameter, and one of the people calls fork gets back another one, right? So then you just check which one you are and break out of the for loop, right? You break out of the for loop if you're the child process. You just say, if I'm the child process, break out of the for loop. Like, that should work, right? FUCon, would you want to be one of the first people to play around with JAI, or would you wait till it gets more mature? I think it probably depends on when it gets released. I probably won't have time when it actually is released to look at it as one of the first people, because I'll probably be right in the middle of trying to finish 1935. That'd be my guess. But if it happened to conclude, if he happens to release it at a time when I am more free and have some time to devote to it, then I might be. So I don't think it will have much to do with my desire to check it out or not. It'll have more to do with what my schedule is at the time. Because in order to really check out a programming language, you got to spend some serious time with it. Like, you can't just go read through it and be like, it looks good or not. It's like, I'd have to actually spend some time because, you know, John is making a bunch of decisions, and in order to say whether those decisions were good or bad, you can't just like look at them and go like, oh, well, I don't think I would have done it that way. It's like, well, okay, yeah, but so what? Maybe they were still a bunch of good decisions, and maybe they add up to something really good, and maybe my way that I would have decided would have actually been stupid, right? That's the whole point of that whole process of going through designing something. When you actually have to do it, sometimes you come to very different conclusions than what an armchair analysis would entail. And so I feel like in order to really get into a separate language like JAI, you've got to sit down, spend some serious time with it. And so whether or not I do that close to when it's released is going to be almost entirely dependent on my schedule and not on whether I want to. Are you going to check out OBS Studio this weekend? I have no idea. Urger Kodak, do you work on another game project other than Handmade? Yes, obviously I'm working on 1935 right now. In fact, I guess we have a website even. You know what? Molly1935.com. There's nothing on here at the moment, but this is actually the game that I'm working on at the moment at my actual job. So yeah, that's what I work on during the day. Hello, Alan. Is fork a good API or a bad API? I don't know really how to answer that question. I guess what I would say about fork is that if the goal of the API was to fork the process, it's a good API. If the goal is to have ways of creating more processes, probably not, because it's really not what you want to do usually. Like, I don't usually need to clone the memory of the process, and it sort of creates a need for copy on write page handling that wouldn't have otherwise been there, and it's very heavyweight for certain circumstances. So I think what I would say is it depends on what they were actually trying to do with it. I don't know what their goals were at the time that fork was designed, and so either it was a good or a bad API, or I should say whether it's bad or not kind of depends on what the goal was, I think, and I don't know. GDC is next week. What Handmade Hero representation at GDC? I will not be at GDC. All right. I think that's enough cues. I think that's enough cues for now. By the way, Alan, I will try to remember to send you that crash dump. I uploaded it to Google last night, and then I forgot to check this morning to make sure it was done and send it to you. But I got that 1 gigabyte crash dump for you. Which, by the way, I think it's pretty awesome that we've been using 4Coders. We've had literally 1 crash and no other problems with 4Coder pretty much this entire time. So it's been doing pretty awesome for a program that's barely, it hasn't not even had a it's not even in beta yet, and it's already doing pretty darn good. So nice work, man. It's very nice work. All right, let's go ahead and wind things down here. Let's see, close. You know what, I probably shouldn't have closed that because I don't actually know if I ever bothered to save the to-do text, but that's okay because it was already an accurate to-do list anyway. Thank you everyone for joining me for another episode of Handmade Hero. It's been a pleasure coding with you as always. If you would like to follow along with Handmade Hero at home, you can always go to handmadehero.org and pre-order the game. It comes with the source code so you can follow along and do your own experiments and learning. We also have a forum site where you can go to ask questions if you have questions about the stuff we've done. We have a Patreon page you can go to if you want to support the video series. And we have a tweet bot that you can go to check the schedule. Everything you need is there. The editor that we use on stream is 4Coder. You can search for it. It's a project by someone who's actually on the chat, Alan Webster. And it's what we're using right now. You can go to his 4Coder page on Patreon, like I just did. Type 4Coder into Google, it'll take you there. And if you pledge, there's 3 different tiers. You can pledge $1 a month to it, and you just get a copy of 4Coder. If you could do $5 a month, and you get 4Coder plus the customization API DLL stuff you can use to program it in C, which is what I used to create the one we use on Handmade Hero. And if you do $10 or more a month, you actually get my Handmade Hero one comes with it. So you can actually get the customizations that we use on the stream if those interest you. So check that out. Yeah, check out the tweet bot if you want the schedule for next week. I think it'll probably be a pretty standard schedule next week. Don't anticipate anything too weird, but you never know. So check the tweet bot. Until then, I will see you guys Monday for another round of programming. I think we'll go ahead and finish the debug stuff next week probably because we kind of left that and we just got to go back there and dig through it a little bit. And get it into a nice usable shape. So until then, have fun programming this weekend, and I will see you guys on the internet. Take it easy.